Ladies and gentlemen, this is DVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we're diving deep into something that many of you may have missed while doom scrolling past your daily cat videos. Russia's brand new eye-watering federal budget proposal for 2025 and beyond. Spoiler alert, it's all about tanks, missile, and a lot more rubles being pumped into war. But hey, don't panic, unless, of course, you're a Russian taxpayer, then yeah, maybe panic just a little bit. Your health insurance may not insure as much as you thought, but hey, at least the meat grinder won't be empty. Well, without further ado, here's our latest report on this issue.
The Russian government has submitted a budget proposal for 2025-2027, revealing a significant increase in defense spending. According to official data, military expenditures will rise by 25% compared to 2024, reaching approximately 6.3% of GDP. The federal budget outlines military spending of around $140 billion for 2025, marking a 59% increase from initial expectations for the year. This increase will primarily be funded by cuts to social spending and ongoing economic growth, which is expected to exacerbate inflation. In contrast, social expenditures will decrease from $79 billion to nearly $67 billion, while education and healthcare funding will see only slight adjustments, effectively reducing their real value due to inflation. Consequently, defense spending will constitute 1/3 of the total budget, with national security expenditures accounting for an additional 8%. Notably, the budget will be the most secretive in Russian history, with classified items comprising 31.6% of expenditures. The government aims to maintain a nearly balanced budget, forecasting a deficit of 0.5% of GDP in 2025, funded mainly through domestic borrowing, which will raise public debt from 15.7% to 16.5% of GDP. Despite these challenges, economic growth is anticipated, fueled by high military expenditures. However, ongoing inflation and high interest rates from the central bank, projected between 15% to 20%, are likely to strain public finances and hinder access to market funds, further complicating the economic landscape.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, Moscow recently released a draft proposal for its federal budget for 2025, and the big headline, a whopping 13.5 trillion rubles for national defense. That's roughly $140 billion for those of us who haven't memorized our ruble exchange rates. And just in case you're worried about Russia cooling things down anytime soon, the plan doesn't stop there. The budget stays massive in 2026 and 2027 with just a tiny drop in 2026. That's the Russian government's equivalent of a budgetary humble brag. Now, why is this happening, you ask? Oh, it's simple. Russia is preparing for a long war, maybe not just in Ukraine, but beyond. You see, even if they stop bombing their neighbors for a day or two, the military budget will still dwarf pre-war levels by multiple times. Back in the peaceful pre-full-scale invasion era of 2021, they were spending around 4 times less. Remember those simpler times? Yeah, no, me neither. But here's the deal. These increases aren't just some accounting quirk or a military splurge. This is a sign that Russia is expecting their war machine to keep grinding well into the future. And all this military spending, well, it's putting a serious strain on their economy. Now, this draft budget is a huge win for Russia's Ministry of Defense and its military-industrial complex. For them, this means more tanks, more missiles, and more power. For regular Russians, though, this means higher inflation, less money in their pockets, and a government that's increasingly isolated. So, with the ruble doing its best impression of a kamikaze plane, what does the Kremlin do to balance this giant military budget? They run. No, not literally, though that would be fun to watch. They run faster with expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. In simpler terms, they just keep printing more rubles. Great news for military contractors, bad news for anyone trying to buy bread. To put it in perspective, the Kremlin's entire economic strategy right now is to keep throwing money at the war so that the GDP doesn't shrink. Not to grow it, mind you, just to stop it from collapsing in on itself like a black hole or bad economic decisions. It's basically an Olympic sprint just to stay where they are. Now, this military spending is rebalancing the entire Russian economy in favor of the loyalists, the oligarchs, and the defense sector. Regular Russians? Well, not so much. They're stuck footing the bill. This means fewer resources for things like healthcare, education, or that one road near your house that still hasn't been paved. Instead, more money is funneled towards a defense budget designed for an endless war. And what's the Kremlin's long-term goal? Well, it's to keep the economy afloat just long enough to avoid a total collapse while continuing their military spending binge. Expansionary policies are their only hope to prevent a full-blown recession. But these policies come with a price: inflation, devaluation, and an increasingly unsustainable economic model. So, what does the future hold for Russia? Well, more war, more rubles, and a whole lot of financial pain. But hey, at least the Ministry of Defense is having a good time. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Witold Rutkiewicz, Senior Fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So today we are taking a look at Russia's military budget. People often say, you look at what they do instead of what they say, and I think there's no more honest signal than where people are putting their money. When it comes to this Russian defense budget, we're seeing an increase that's stretching all the way to 2026 and then some. Do you think that's a projection of where the Russians think the war is going?
Well, I think the Russians are, in this particular case, thinking in more long-term, in long-term terms. Namely, it's clear that this is a budget that is supposed not only to provide sufficient material and sufficient funding for the current war against Ukraine, but also it's to replace the losses and to rebuild and reconstitute the forces. We know that the Russians have been suffering quite serious losses during the last 2.5 years. They are still thinking about, one has to remember that the basic assumption of the Russian leadership is that their main conflicts not with Ukraine but with the West. So these guys think they have to be prepared for a possible war. And please, what is significant here is the comparison between the growth of military expenditure and the kind of devotion to this issue and commitment to this on the part of the Russian leadership and sort of unwillingness of especially Western European countries, significant countries like Germany, to increase their military budgets. Yeah, they do it, but they do it slowly, and they are not. In Germany's case, they are not even. They haven't reached yet 2% GDP that had been promised in 2014 as part of the NATO declaration, NATO summit in Wales, and there is a lot of creative accounting. By the way, if you count, if you look at, for example, the German budget, military budget. So it is clear the Russians are preparing for war, and they started doing this much earlier. I have to remind you that already in 2007, Putin felt sufficiently confident about the balance of forces that Russia basically repudiated the CFE treaty, which was the treaty that was signed, basically the valid version was signed in 1999 and was supposed to provide, reductions and to provide a kind of a balance between Western forces and Russia. You don't give up a disarmament and arms limitation treaty if you feel you are weaker and your enemy is about to outspend you. So this is a warning sign in the long term.
Right, warning sign indeed. And like you mentioned, when we take a look at how Russians and the Western countries kind of approach this war in Ukraine, there seems to be a little bit of disconnect and consensus in where things are going. A lot of discussions in the Western world now is perhaps the war in Ukraine slowly grinding to a halt, and there's need to go to the negotiation table and end the war in the near future, with what you managed to mention, that Western countries like Germany, for example, being relatively reluctant to increase its spending. Do you see some kind of disconnect here? Do you see a warning sign to be made that while the West is trying to slow down their investment when it comes to the military sector, Russia is still amping it up?
Well, obviously, I mean, this is clear, and what you said is, in particular, important. That is, there is this narrative, which is kind of, I think it's mainstream narrative in the West. I think it's shared by significant sections of Western political class, that the war is about to end, that we can have negotiations and we can have ceasefire. I mean, it's so detached from reality that it boggles one's mind, and really, because the bottom line is, I mean, it's very simple on some. I mean, why would Russians agree to a ceasefire when they think they are winning? I mean, what's the point from their point of view? And negotiations, the Russians are, of course, willing to enter into negotiations, but what they mean by that is that they want to basically enter negotiations to accept surrender terms. That's what they mean. So, even if we have negotiations, which the Western leaders kind of seem to want, the Russians are going to present basically the same maximalist position that they had presented. I mean, they've been presenting throughout this war. And this is not going to be the end, because please remember that the war started after the Russians placed on the table demands that were directed not so much towards Ukraine, but towards NATO and Washington. And at that time, they demanded basically the neutralization of Central Europe and withdrawal of NATO basically back to Germany, to German-Polish border, so to speak figuratively.
Right. How much of this reluctance to participate by the Western leaders' party is actually due to perhaps their hands being forced by some of these Ukraine fatigue kicking in? We do see that recent election and polling all shows that parties that are more reluctant to help Ukraine seems to be gaining in numbers. Is there also like an alarming sign here where these Western politicians have no choice but to kind of convince the population that maybe the war is grinding to a halt, or at least is coming to a close, because that's the general consensus that people want to believe?
Well, there is always a choice, and I think there is a failure of leadership on part of the Western, especially Western political class. They are supposed to lead. They should understand the consequences. And I think there are of course sections. It would be unfair to paint everyone with the same brush. There are political forces, there are leaders who are proposing, who are arguing for a more realistic policy. But unfortunately, they don't seem to be having an upper hand in this. But the bottom line again is that the defeat of Ukraine and the collapse of Ukraine is not going to end the conflict between Russia and the West. Russia is not going to give up on its aggressive designs on Europe, Central Europe in particular, and this is going to be in the long run refusal to face the music and contribute in money and equipment is going to result in the necessity down, in a few years' time or even sooner, to face a real war on the NATO's eastern flank, and millions of refugees. By the way, I mean, this is one of the things that people seem to forget, that after Bucha and after Russian atrocities in occupied Ukraine, if Ukrainian resistance break down and Russian troops occupy significant sections of Ukraine, you're going to have millions of refugees in Central Europe.
Right, but what about the Russian side, though? I can't really imagine pumping this much resources into military alone is good for the Russian economy. How are they going to sustain all of that?
By indebting yourself. By the way, Russia has a very low debt, national debt, and it's earning huge amounts of money still from exporting its oil, gas, natural resources, fertilizers, now food. This is also a kind of a reflection of failure of the West to apply and to implement sanctions that had been imposed, and the slow pace of sanctions that had been, gradually tightened, but they should have been applied immediately to the full extent that they are now being slowly being applied. But also enforcement is a problem, huge problem, and the inability of the Western leaders, the Western countries to close off the possibilities for sanction breaking by the so-called parallel export mechanism, which is a very simple one. People in countries that trade with Russia import goods that Russia would have imported, and then they re-export them to Russia. I mean, if you look at the level of imports of countries, of Central Asian countries, a country like Armenia, Kazakhstan, for a time Turkey as well, you see that in important dual-use equipment categories, there's been a huge increase during the last 3 years of import of these countries from the EU and even from the US. And where do these things go? They don't go. They are not consumed in these countries. They are re-exported to Russia. So this is a huge failure of Western policy.
Right, definitely something very alarming indeed, and we do have to make sure that these sanctions being applied isn't full of holes, much like that of a Swiss cheese. Meanwhile, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The European Union has approved a substantial plan to provide Ukraine with a €35 billion loan to support its economy, severely impacted by the ongoing war with Russia. The loan, funded by revenues from Russian frozen central bank assets, is part of a broader G7 initiative, offering Kyiv overall €45 billion in aid.
Profits from these frozen assets will be used to repay the loan over time, giving Ukraine flexibility in how it spends the funds. Distribution is expected to begin early next year. The agreement, reached on October 9th, came amid Hungary's opposition to key sanctions reforms. Budapest aims to block a proposal to extend the renewal period for sanctions on Russia's frozen asset from 6 months to 36 until after the US presidential election. The longer renewal period aims to prevent individual EU members, such as Hungary, from disrupting sanctions or unfreezing assets. The G7's plan is crucial to maintaining financial pressure on Russia, with concerns that without access to frozen assets, the West may have to cover the loan costs.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has set a goal to end Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine by 2025. During his visit to Croatia on October 9th, Zelensky emphasized the need for decisive action in the coming months, pointing to opportunities on the battlefield that could pave the way for peace.
While in Croatia, the Ukrainian president called for strong leadership from his US counterpart Joe Biden, as well as for support from key European nations to help achieve lasting stability in Europe. Ukraine continues to face intense military challenges, especially in the Donetsk region, where Russian forces are securing slow but steady gains. As a consequence, Ukrainian troops recently withdrew from Vuhledar, a key defensive position. The decision was made on the backdrop of Russian pressure increasingly mounting on further Ukrainian towns like Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Despite these setbacks, Zelensky remains committed to his anti-war efforts, including finalizing a peace framework by November. Ukraine's victory plan aims to bring an end to the current war without giving up any of the territories annexed by Russia, securing a lasting peace. Zelensky presented it to Biden in September and plans to share it with other global leaders once the Ramstein summit, postponed due to Hurricane Milton hitting the US, is rescheduled.
Lithuania upgraded the fortifications on key bridge over the Niemen River that connect it to Russia's Kaliningrad exclave. Dragon's teeth barriers and iron beams were installed to strengthen the structure, with plans to reinforce other nearby bridges, potentially using mines.
This move comes amid heightened tensions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has raised fears of a broader conflict involving NATO. Lithuania, which borders Kaliningrad and Belarus, would be on the front lines of such a clash. Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian territory wedged between NATO members Poland and Lithuania, hosts Russia's Baltic Fleet and is packed with military equipment. Lithuania, along with Estonia and Latvia, has agreed to build a Baltic defense line to reinforce its eastern borders. A staunch supporter of Ukraine, Lithuania has provided significant military aid, including ammunition, armored vehicles, and anti-drone systems. Relations with Moscow have deteriorated sharply since the war began, with an increasing number of incidents along the Kaliningrad-Moscow railway further escalating tensions.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.